this thing on. Good morning, everyone. So, just to give you a heads up, I had a little trouble yesterday uploading the trunk lecture. Apparently, it was it was an hour, 20 minutes. It was a big file. I was having trouble downloading it, and needless to say, I had to break this up into two parts. So this is the second video for Tuesday. I'm going to get into some review stuff, specifically the stuff that I ended the first video on, which is stretching concepts. Okay, so I have a TheraBand here that's going to represent a muscle pull. Obviously, the elastic stuff, not the contractile stuff, but it still represents what a muscle does, and it's pull. So as we know, the longer we stretch it, the more it wants to return to its original shape. Okay, so muscles pull on both ends. Sometimes, even though they're pulling down here, sometimes they anchor and they get the other side moving, and sometimes this side anchors and it gets the other part moving. Okay, so what I wanted to explain is types of questions that you can have on the test. First is function. You're going to have to be accountable for all of the different muscles that are in each group that you're held accountable for, right? So remember, I'm only giving you the prime movers, the big dogs, the most important ones. So you're going to have to know the specific muscles that make up the cervical flexors, the cervical extensors, the right lateral cervical benders, left lateral cervical benders, right transverse cervical rotators, left transverse cervical rotators. And you can remember those based off of lists or your functional circles. Then you're going to have to understand, or I say then, a different way of understanding the same thing is what's all of the functions of a single muscle. In other words, what are the different groups that the right sternocleidomastoid is in? The right sternocleidomastoid pulls in a direction of cervical flexion, right lateral cervical bending, and left transverse cervical rotation. Okay. Now we're going to talk about stretch concepts. How do you lengthen a muscle when you're trying to stretch it? And if you know the function, in other words, if you know the direction of motion that the muscle is pulling in, then lengthening it is going to be position or motion in the opposite direction of its pull. I'm going to make this muscle up, but imagine you had a muscle that went from your chin to your chest. Okay, so obviously it'd be pulling in a direction of cervical flexion. So if I extend, I lengthen, of which is a flexion puller. Okay, so let's go back to our sternocleidomastoid. It's a cervical flexion puller. It's a flexor. So I'm going to lengthen it by extending. It's a right lateral bending puller. So I'm going to lengthen it by left laterally bending. It is a left transverse cervical rotator. So I'm actually going to lengthen it by looking to my right in the transverse plane. That makes sense? Okay. So it's going to be the same thing for the muscles of the trunk. Trunk flexors are going to be stretched by extending. Right lateral trunk benders are going to be stretched by bending to the left. Left transverse trunk pullers are going to be stretched by twisting to the right. Okay. The area that gets confused a lot is lefts and rights. Okay. So take note of that. Lefts and rights get confusing. What I mean by that is for your cervical, the right-sided sternocleidomastoid pulls right lateral but left transverse. Make sense? Remember, it's 310 review, but right and left mean two different things in two different dimensions. Do a cartwheel to your right, do a cartwheel to your left. That's frontal plane right and left. point to your right, point to your left, and then spin to your right, spin to your left. That's like a merry-go-round kind of concept. So the right-sided sternocleidomastoid bends right lateral, but left transverse, pulls in those directions. So to stretch the right sternocleidomastoid, you want to bend to the left and spin to the right. Now dip, baby, dip. Yeah. So I hope that helps and clarifies some things in terms of stretching and function. Okay. So first 2 days, I actually intended on doing another lecture yesterday, but I was having my phone ran out of memory and I was having trouble downloading it so that I could delete it to start another lecture. So maybe this is for the best. Maybe it's good that the first couple days we just kind of gradually work into one section at a time. But starting Wednesday, we're going to have to double up. I'm going to have to start doing 2 separate lectures on muscles. So as my major professor always used to say, eat the apple in little bites. Okay, so you don't want to wait until the weekend to try to cram all this stuff. I'd wait until the weekend to try to really develop this stuff, but you want to try to watch and absorb little bits every day. Okay, so what are you? Okay, this is a quick review. Okay, make sure we're on the same page. You're going to need to understand the function of the right and the left sternocleidomastoids, the right and the left erector spinae at the cervical vertebra. At the trunk, you're going to have to know the functions of the right and the left rectus abdominis, the right and the left external obliques, which have the same line of pull as the sternocleidomastoids, the right and the left internal obliques. They run the same up, down, and side to side, but they have different angulations, right? They have different transverse pull as their same-sided external. They actually have the exact same pull as the opposite external. So the right internal and the left external have the same transverse pull. Remember Chewbacca belt. Okay. And then the right and the left erector spinae. Okay. So you're going to have to know function. Who are the cervical flexors? Who are the cervical extensors? Who are the right, left lateral cervical benders, right, left transverse cervical rotators? Who are the trunk flexors, trunk extensors, right lateral, right transverse, left transverse? You're going to have to know the specific functions of each muscle. What does the left internal oblique do? What directions does it pull? Okay. And then I'll have some examples like we did on the Tuesday's lecture 1, where I might on the test have an exercise and say, hey, which external oblique is being innervated here, being worked? Which internal oblique? Which erector spinae? Remember the side plank example. So I can specifically ask you to identify a muscle or muscles in practical exercises, okay? So that's why it's important to practice, and let me know if you have any questions, okay? So this is just a quick little summary. Again, I'm really going out of my way to try to make sure we're all on the same page here, so that you know exactly the kind of questions you're going to be asked. Remember, in terms of function, function does not mean contraction. Function means direction of pull. Contraction means contraction. So when we say function, we're talking about what direction of motion does a muscle pull in. And a muscle, like say my elbow, my bicep, my elbow flexor, it's an elbow flexor, it pulls in the direction of flexion regardless of if it's working isometrically, eccentrically, concentrically, it still pulls in the same direction. The analogy I give in 310 is the elevator, right? Why do you call an elevator an elevator? Because it makes you go up, but it also keeps you from falling down and it lets you go down. So in other words, a majority of the time, the elevator isn't making you go up. Majority of the time, it's just standing still. But the cable is always pulling up. The elevator is the direction of pull, making you go up, preventing you from falling down, and then pulling up, by letting you go down, right? You don't have a rope that pulls the elevator down. You would, what's the fancy way of saying it? Die. So muscle function is direction of pull. Contraction is contraction. Motion is motion. But function of a muscle is its direction of pull. And that's important. So that means that the right sternocleidomastoid, and this one right here, sternum, clavicle, mastoid process, sternocleidomastoid. It is a cervical flexor, meaning that it pulls in the direction of cervical flexion, regardless of if it's working isometrically, concentrically, or eccentrically. So one of the ways I'm going to check your understanding of this concept on the test is I'm going to say, hey, what's the function? Hey, what's the function of the right sternocleidomastoid in the sagittal plane of the cervical vertebra if it's working eccentrically? And some of you may overthink, well, if it's working eccentrically, then you're going to observe cervical extension. That's a motion. Function is direction of pull. So that sternocleidomastoid, if it be working eccentrically, remember the example we gave with the cervical exercises. In other words, even if it's working eccentrically, it's still pulling in a direction of cervical flexion. It's still a cervical flexor. So we are going to differentiate cervical and trunk function based on planes. So you got to know sagittal function, frontal function, transverse function. So that's how I'm going to differentiate. If I want you to, if a muscle has 3 functions and I want you to communicate 2 of them, I'm going to talk about it in terms of planes. Sagittal and frontal function of the right sternocleidomastoid. There's the sagittal function, there's the frontal function. What about frontal and transverse? Frontal, transverse. Okay. All right. As always, hit me up if you have questions. Text me and we can set up a time to FaceTime or Zoom if we need. I'm willing to do what I can to make sure you guys understand what's going to be asked of you on the test. Okay. All righty. Y'all have a good Tuesday.